Get all my microphones turned on right here. Hey, this is Jason Clemmons, DC at the Rock Health and Wellness Center, and this is Life with Jason Clemmons, DC. That's what it is. That's who I am, and that's what it is. We're live right here at the Rock Health and Wellness Center studios like we are most nights, Monday through Friday from 6 to 7. We're on the radio at 98.7 Walk by Faith, 1420 AM Lubbock Christian Nation, streaming all over the world at 987radio.com. and all over social media on Facebook, X, and YouTube. So, yeah, let's get after it. There's a bunch of stuff that I want to talk about tonight, and this is going to be a really different kind of show. But there was a paper came out. There was a final report of the COVID. What do they call this here? The oversight House subcommittee. The select subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're not going to talk about treating it or any of that sort of thing. We're going to talk about some things that I think are important to know and how you evolve your thinking when it comes to health. So this show is probably going to be kind of serious. It's going to be mature, I hope. It's going to be something that if you're, you might have to focus for just a minute. You might have to focus on this one just a little bit so that you can think about this, because I'm going to present some ideas on the evolution of thought with health and wellness, because you have to start somewhere. You have to start somewhere in the evolution of thought. You can't. If you're going to start, because what's going to happen when you get started thinking about health and wellness, and maybe some of you guys already have, you've already thought about it, maybe a little bit, right? You started to listen to this show. You've caught me on the radio. You're catching me on social media, or you're a patient in the office, right? And then now you've come to start to listen to the show because you've been a patient and you started listening to the show, and you're like, okay. He's saying stuff that's kind of weird, and I don't understand why he says that, and I don't understand what he's talking about. This guy's crazy. Like I don't even get it where he's coming from. Well, that's what I want to take this opportunity tonight, and I want to just take layers of it. I want to take layers of thought over time so that we can add another one. We've done a show like this before, but we're going to add another layer on it tonight. And we're just going to read what these guys say. And we're going to talk about just the last 4 years, 5 years almost, of knowledge and where I got some of my knowledge about how I want to take care of me and my family. Because I think that's really ultimately what you want to do. You want to have the best knowledge that you can have to take care of you and your family. You want to have the truth, which is hard to come by these days. It's really hard to figure out what is true and what is not true when it comes to health. There's so many people involved in health and wellness, which is great. I'm glad it's a conversation, but there's so many things, and there's so many. Even in the final report that we're going to talk about tonight, there's some of those things. So I think once you start studying something, I'll use an example just because it's fun for me. I'll use an example of football, right? Just because when you start studying something, and we could talk defense tonight. I don't know. We'll talk about three technique. Let's just talk about that. What you don't know. Most people walking around have no idea what that means. What a three technique is. Like they're like, what? Like I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't even follow football, right? So if you're going to back up and you're going to follow football, then you're going to follow offense and defense. And then if you're going to follow offense and defense, you're going to start to figure out the philosophy of defense. And then you're going to when you get to the philosophy of defense, you're going to start to figure out that there's 8 gaps that you got to cover because you got to stop the run. And then you got to figure out, how am I going to do that? And then what am I going to do to stop that? And then how am I going to line these people up? And then how am I going to be able to make a call in the middle of a game to make sure that they can line up properly? And because I need to be able to make a call, because those idiots over there on offense are going 1,000 miles an hour and they're just throwing the ball all over the place and all this stuff, right? So it gets you all the way down to how you're gonna coach that defensive tackle right there in that technique. And we say anything that's on the inside shade. If you're on the inside shade of that guard, we would call that a one technique. And that means that one technique person there's an A gap, there's a B gap, there's a C gap, and if there's a tight end right there, there's a D gap on outside of him. So what I would say is, that one technique is an inside shade person on the guard. Okay, now I'm going to move over, and I'm going to say the two technique is a head up to the guard. And then I'm going to move over, and I'm going to say that the three technique is on the outside shade of the guard. That's the three technique, and the three technique is responsible for the B gap. The one technique is responsible for the A gap. So now, if I'm going to teach that right there, and I'm teaching this kid how to play, which hand is he going to put on the ground, and which foot is he going to put back? What kind of stance is he going to be in when he gets into that position right there? Like, how exactly is he going to do that? It's so funny. When I'm walking through my office, and I'm walking from the front to the back, and I've got a hallway on the right and a hallway on the left, and I kind of have it's kind of built like an H. I got a middle hallway in between there, and then I've got a kitchen in the very back. When I'm walking through my office, sometimes, and I turn the corner to go through the H to go to the very back, I do a speed cut. And a speed cut, I don't do it very fast. But when I was coaching wide receivers at New Mexico State, if we were going to run, we had 3 different ways, really, 4 that we would teach a wide receiver. If he was going to run a quick 5-yard out, a 5-yard stop, it was just a one step. Just take off and plant your foot in the ground, put it right straight in the ground. You got one step, turn around, and there's the ball. But if you're going a little bit further and you're going to 10 yards, then you got 2 steps. Bam. You got 2 steps. And the reason we taught that was because the defensive back is going to recognize you're going to break. And the defensive back is going to do 2 steps. He's going to do the first step that he sees plus one more step, and then he's going to break on the ball. So if the defensive back is going to take at least 2 steps, you got to turn around in 1 step. If the defensive back is going to take 3 steps because he's moving a little bit faster, then you got to do a 2-step cut. We worked on that for hours and hours and hours. And in 1996, 97, 95, 94, 95, 1995, we had a 3,000-yard passer, and we had a 1,000-yard receiver, we had a 1,000-yard rusher, and we were the number 4 offense in the country at New Mexico State. And having the number 4 offense in the country at New Mexico State came down to what kind of cut that this person would do. But if you're going to run a quick out route, then you're not going to decelerate at all. All you're going to do is turn your foot, just run straight and turn your foot to your outside foot. Just turn it to a 45-degree angle and run right through the angle. It's called a speed cut. Now you're not planting your foot in the ground and then running out of the break, because you're not going but about 3 yards or maybe 5 yards, and you can do a speed cut on that because you don't need to plant. So when I'm walking down the hall, sometimes I'll walk down the hall and I'll just turn my foot. I'll just turn my foot and I'll just walk instead of planting if I'm going to turn right, instead of planting my left foot and going to the right, I'll just turn my right foot 45 degrees, and I'll just turn in the hallway. And almost every single time I do that, I say, that's a speed cut right there. I know that's I know that's a little silly, but that's what I did. I learned that from Coach Ferg in 1994. And however many years, that seems to me like that's like 30 years ago. I learned that, and that's how detailed it was. That's how detailed it was to try to win a football game. That's how detailed it was to try to be good at what we were doing. And then when I came to Tech, I coached the defensive tackles. And when I coached the defensive tackles and in the secondary, but my guy has to be in that gap, and I got to keep him in that gap. So I got to make sure that his feet are set right. I got to make sure that change his hands. We would change. It wouldn't just always be and put your right hand down. We would put the hand down closest to the guy. We would step into him. We would step into him. We would plant. We get our outside arm, and we would make sure that we're stayed on that outside shoulder right there, so we can stay in that gap. And that's that. It's an evolution. It's an evolution of thought that gets so particular into trying to be good at what you're doing. That's the point of it. That's what I'm trying to say, is that it has to be an evolution of thought to be good at what you're doing. Well, this whole chiropractic wellness thing isn't something that's just really quick. This chiropractic wellness thing is hours and hours and hours of this same type of stuff. I don't know how many hours. It's 24 years now, 24 and a half years now of meticulous learning and stacking and learning. And it's like, do you get a flu shot? No, I don't get a flu shot. Why? Because I got a 3 technique right there. It's got to stay in the B gap. That step has his left hand down and his left foot back. It's like, he's going to punch with his right hand. I got a wide receiver that's going to run a 5-yard out, and I'm going to turn his foot, and we're going to be number 4 in the country in passing. That's why. And you're like, wait a minute, slow down. What did you just say? Yes, because I've studied the living heck out of it, and I can't find anywhere in a wellness model that I'm going to inject myself with a flu shot. And you think, why? Why don't you take a Tylenol? What is your problem with Tylenol? Same thing. It's like, no, I'm not going to do that. It's going to have to be an extreme case for that, right? It's not. I hear people talk about prostate cancer. I've got guys that have prostate cancer, and they talk about prostate cancer, and they're like, you know what, my PSA is high or whatever, right? And I'm like, don't take another shot. And they're like, why? And I'm like, well, I'm just telling you based on everything that I've studied, you don't want to do that. And so I know that was like, whoa, that was like a little intense. That was a little intense to start the show right there. And I guarantee you will not get any other video or any other thing that you're going to watch, podcast or anything, that's going to connect a 3 technique stance to taking a flu shot and what you're going to do with your health. This is the only, I'll probably almost guarantee that this is the only show on the internet in the world that will make that connection right there. So let's talk about what I want to talk about tonight. Because I just saw this thing, right? This oversight committee. Now, let's get serious for a second, and let's understand let's understand the medium of which this information is coming to us. That's one of the things that we have to have, and I call it discernment. And I learned it from a guy about 20 years ago that taught me some of this stuff. You have to listen to the information. You have to run the information through lots of filters, and then you have to discern. And my dad used to say, use your brain. You have to use your brain a little bit. So the first thing This came out December 2nd, 2024. So this was yesterday, right? Final report. This comes from the oversight. This is oversight.house.gov. This is the government. Final report. COVID Select concludes 2-year investigation, issuing 500 plus page final report on lessons learned and the path forward. And it says today the select committee, the select subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic concluded its 2-year investigation into the COVID-19 pandemic and released a final report titled After Action Review of the COVID-19 Pandemic, the Lessons Learned and the Path Forward. Okay, first thing is you have to understand, you don't have to understand anything, but I have to understand this started off as a select subcommittee in Congress. Well, that just by definition has a bunch of crap related to it, right? We all know that Republicans and Democrats are going to create their own narrative, however they want to say it. And they're going to say whatever they want to say, and the other side's just going to completely say the opposite thing of what they want to say. And then here comes all the BS that goes along with it, and you just got to try to sift your way through it and see if you can try to learn if any of it actually is real. Okay? So what I don't see this and just think to myself, oh, well, of course, this is the gospel truth right here. This is exactly the truth. No, that's not the way I do it. I look at it and I say, okay, what are these boys, what are they going to say? And does it fit in any of the other filters that I study? Because otherwise they just call you a conspiracy theorist, which is just a hogwash name that they've made up, right? It's like, if you want to talk about anything that's outside the mainstream, then they'll just call you a conspiracy theorist. But let's just talk about what these guys did, okay? So let's talk a little bit more right here. It says, the final report will serve as a roadmap for Congress, the executive branch, and the private sector to prepare for and respond to future pandemics. Now, I expect the next pandemic, since the 1918 Spanish flu was the last one, and it took 102 years before we got another pandemic, I'm expecting that it'll be 102 years before we get another pandemic. Yeah, y'all ain't buying that either, right? Right? Because why? Because why'd we have this one, right? Since February 2023, the Select Subcommittee has sent more than 100 investigative letters, conducted more than 30 transcribed interviews and depositions, and held 25 hearings and meetings, and reviewed more than 1 million pages of documents. Members and staff have exposed high-level corruption in America's public health systems, confirmed the most likely origin of the pandemic, held COVID-19 bad actors publicly accountable, fostered bipartisan consensus on consequential pandemic-era issues, and more. It's a 520-page final report details all the findings of the Select Committee. So you can go right there. But here's just the highlights, because I'm not about to get into 520 pages of this. But here's the highlights that the origins of the coronavirus pandemic, including but not limited to the federal government's funding of gain-of-function research. COVID-19 origin. COVID-19 most likely emerged, and I'm just reading off of the government's website right here, okay? COVID-19, I'll even share it with you, just so you, on social media, you guys can know that I'm just reading it off right here, okay? It says this. COVID-19 most likely emerged from a laboratory in Wuhan, China. The 5 strongest arguments in favor of this lab leak theory include, number 1, the virus possesses a biological characteristic that is not found in nature. And one of the things they call it is a foreign cleavage site. And if you want to, you can go get Rand Paul's book called Deception, The Great Cover-Up, The Great COVID Cover-Up by Rand Paul, and he'll do an amazing job of explaining to you what a foreign cleavage site is and how this thing showed up in a lab because they put it on the virus. Okay? They put it on the virus. It didn't just spontaneously show up. The virus possesses a biological characteristic that is not found in nature. Data shows that all COVID-19 cases stem from a single introduction into humans. This runs contrary to previous pandemics where there were multiple spillover events. We're talking about one spot, okay? Wuhan is home to China's foremost SARS research lab, which has a history of conducting gain-of-function research in inadequate biosafety levels. Wuhan Institute of Virology researchers were sick with a COVID-like virus in the fall of 2019, months before COVID-19 was discovered at the wet market. And by nearly all measures of science, there was evidence of natural origin. If there was evidence of natural origin, it would have already surfaced. And they get into proximal origin publication. The proximal origins of SARS-CoV-2 publication, which was used repeatedly by public health officials and the media to discredit the lab leak theory, was prompted by Dr. Fauci to push the perverted narrative that COVID-19 originated in nature. And we all went through this, right? We all went through this thing, and we all got we got separated from each other. We got put into adversarial positions amongst each other. We got lied to about the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. We got told that if you got vaccinated, the virus stopped, and if you were unvaccinated, you were the ones that were holding everybody hostage. And people even, I think to this day, are seriously intense about this whole thing. I remember going into the grocery store and them having the entire section of almonds and cashews, and all the nuts were covered in plastic. And on the very opposite, the very next row over, then all the Cokes were wide open, because we're going to cover up the nutritious food, and then we're going to give us all of the processed food. And we all know it, right? And I'm not really trying to be negative about the whole thing. Let me read some more. Gain-of-function research. A lab-related incident involving gain-of-function research is most likely the origin of COVID-19. Current government mechanisms for the overseeing this dangerous gain-of-function research are incomplete, severely convoluted, and lack global applicability. EcoHealth Alliance, under the leadership of Dr. Peter Daszak, used U.S. taxpayer dollars to facilitate dangerous gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China. After the Select Subcommittee released evidence of EcoHealth violating the terms of its National Institutes of Health grant, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services commenced official debarment proceedings and suspended all funding to EcoHealth. New evidence also shows that the Department of Justice has opened an investigation into EcoHealth's pandemic-era activities. And the last one was NIH failures. National Institutes of Health procedures for funding and overseeing potential dangerous research are deficient, unreliable, and pose a serious threat to both public health and national security. Further, the NIH fostered an environment that promoted evading federal records keeping laws, as seen through the action of Dr. David Moran's and FOIA lady Marge Moore. So, what is this saying? Basically what they're saying to me, and this is a congressional report, basically what they're saying to me is that the origins of COVID came from people doing what's called gain-of-function research. And I'm going to map it out. I'm going to map it out to take it all the way through, because I think it's important for us to understand it, because it has to do with whether or not you take your vitamin D. It has to do with whether or not you're going to eat refined carbohydrates. It has to do with whether or not you're going to get up and exercise today. If you don't, it's the same thing I'm talking about the speed cut or the 3 technique. If you don't understand why you're doing the things that you're doing for your health, then you will get lost in all of this garbage that gets passed on. You'll just get lost in what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I I just don't want you to do that. We mentioned it last night about my friend who died. I don't want you to be one of those people that get lost in all of the garbage. So that's why I'm trying to map it out for you, because the next thing that I want to show you is it's basically saying, look, gain of function takes a virus and it teaches it something to do in a lab. It increases um, its ability in a lab in a way that it would never happen in nature. It would take 700 years for that virus to be able to do what they teach it to do in a lab. And then that got loose. They were working on it and it got loose. And then it got loose. And then all of a sudden our immune systems had to try to figure out, our immune systems had to catch up with 700 years of evolution. Not that kind of evolution, but learning and learning and working and learning and working and learning and working. It had to catch up with 700 years in order for us to make sure that we got through some of it. That's why I didn't care if I had a fever. If I had 102 fever for 11 straight days, I was fine with it, because I was like, my immune system is catching up with 700 years of evolution, because I knew that it was made in the lab in 2020. And I'll tell you when we come back from the break why I knew that and why people looked at me like I was an idiot back then. But I'll tell you why I did that. So let's take a break and we'll be right back. Yeah, and if you're just joining us, you got any comments or questions, you want to send them to me, I'd be thank you, Susan. You are unique. You are unique, Coach Dr. C. That's exactly right. I promise you that no one on the internet is doing that. That 3 technique's important right there. I'll just talk about it while we're on the break. It's kind of fun, but you gotta stay in that gap right there. It's important. It's important for that tackle to stay in that gap. There's somebody else that's got that A gap. It's probably that linebacker that's sitting behind him right there. And then I've got a defensive end out there on that side. And what that means is when the offense is going to try to run the ball over there, they can't do it. They can't run the ball because I'm stopped. There's a body in the gap. And if you run into this gap, I'm going to tackle you. And if you run into that gap, he's going to tackle you. And if you try to cut back into that gap, he's going to tackle you. And it's like, okay, now we got our gaps covered right there. And so it's like, if I'm coaching, you guys watched it, like on Saturday, Texas and Texas A&M played against 100,000 people in Kyle Field. And Texas A&M tried to run the ball on the goal line. They had 4th and goal on the goal line. And they thought they could just run right into that Texas defensive line. And that Texas defensive line was like, no, that ain't happening. You know why? Because they had a really big guy. They had a really big guy in that gap. And so when A&M tried to run the ball in that gap, they stuffed them right there on 4th down. And Texas won the game. And now Texas gets to go play Georgia for the SEC championship. And then they get a chance to go play for the national championship. And that just means that more people get to be more Texas fans. And now there's more money and everybody gets paid more money, and everybody's happy if they're in orange, right? That's what that matters right there. And to me, that matters just as much as your vitamin D level. Actually, your vitamin D level matters a lot more to me than that 3 technique in Texas. I really don't care about that 3 technique in Texas, to tell you the honest truth. I know Lewis does. Lewis cares about that. So, all right, let me get back on. Okay, everybody, we're back. This is Life with Jason Clemmons, DC, and we are talking football and health philosophy tonight. So, why do you think these things, right? Okay, where did you already knew that stuff. They came out with it and said it was coronavirus lab leak. And I was like, yep. You know who told me that? Judy Mikovits. But I'm going to get to it in just a second, okay? It says, it's like, what does it mean, gain of function research? And why was the gain of function research in Wuhan? Okay, because if you just search it and you ask yourself, go search and see what Robert Redfield said about it, the origins of COVID. And you'll find some articles about it. It says Trump's former CDC director claims there is a real possibility COVID was born in North Carolina. Uh-oh. It's like Donald Trump's, and this is on MSN of all things, right? It's just an article I found because I just wanted to hear what he said. But Donald Trump's former CDC director has sensationally claimed, of course it is, he sensationally did it because he just claimed it and y'all called it sensational. But he claimed that COVID-19 may have been born from a laboratory in North Carolina, not Wuhan. He had previously been a backer of the lab leak theory, which deemed the disease came from Wuhan instead of in virology in China. But in an unlikely turnaround, Redfield says the disease may have origins in the Tar Heel state as part of a secret biodefense program. He now urges China did not necessarily create the virus and did the best they could once they realized they had a problem. However, he calls the United States' role in the development of the virus substantial. He claims that the American government holds responsibility for funding research into the NIH, USAID, and the Department of Defense. Speaking to the Dana Parrish podcast, Redfield then called out researchers Dr. Rolf Barrick from the University of North Carolina, who he calls the scientific mastermind behind all this. He said, I think he probably helped create some of the original viral lines, but I can't prove that. But he was very involved. Yes. Well, where did I hear that for the first time? I heard that for the first time in 2020, right when this whole thing started, because I listened to this lady named Judy Mikovits, who I had been waiting to hear for years and years and years, and Judy finally showed up in my world. And she finally, so Judy said that. She said it in 2020. She said, no, look, that's not a China virus. The United States has been working on gain of function research. The United States is the one where that had the mice that came from this guy, this Barrick lab, this Ralph Barrick at University of North Carolina. He's the one that developed the mice that had humanized lung tissue that they could do all these tests on. And so Judy was telling us about that back in 2020. And she was saying, look, this is what's going on. This is what's happening. And it's like, this is what gain of function means. It's like, what do you mean gain of function? And what is the history of gain of function? Where does that come from? Well, here's one for you. This is in Science Insider from Biology. This is October 17th of 2014. Here's an article right here. U.S. halts funding for U.S. halts funding for new risky virus studies, calls for voluntary moratorium. And let me make sure I'm sharing this with you. There we go. All right, it's right here. There you go. U.S. halts funding for new risky virus studies. The White House today stepped into an ongoing debate about controversial virus experiments with a startling announcement. It is halting all federal funding for so-called gain-of-function studies that alter a pathogen to make it more transmissible or deadly so that experts can work out a U.S. government-wide policy for weighing the risk. Federal officials are also asking the handful of researchers doing ongoing work in this area to agree to a voluntary moratorium. The pausing on funding, a White House blog states, applies to any new studies that may be reasonably anticipated to confer attributes to influenza, MERS, or SARS virus such that the virus would have enhanced pathogenicity and or transmissibility in mammals via the respiratory route. This was October the 17th of 2014, and it was President Obama is the one that halted the gain of function research because, according to Dr. Mikovits, Dr. PhD Mikovits, there was 700 scientists in the United States that signed a letter asking the government to stop this gain of function research. What does that mean? Studies that alter a pathogen to make it more transmissible or deadly. Yes, right here. That may be reasonably anticipated to confer attributes to influenza, MERS, or SARS virus, such that the virus would have enhanced pathogenicity and or transmissibility in mammals via the respiratory route. The respiratory route, what does Barrick have to do with it? He's the one that created the mice with the humanized lung tissue so they could study the respiratory route of the virus. They could figure out how they could make the virus connect with the lung tissue so that it would be more transmissible and it would be more deadly. They were working on it in a lab. I'm not making this stuff up. Now, do I know all of the stuff that's going on above me? Nope. Am I privy to all this information that's going on? Nope. Do I have to wonder sometimes, is Judy, why'd she show up in 2020? Maybe she's a CIA operative. I don't know. Like, who knows all of that stuff, right? But I've studied it a lot, and I've been doing this now for almost 5 years, and I've been watching these things, and I've been reading these books, and I've been listening to these senators, and they're like, this whole book is about that breaks the whole thing down. And then I've got another one on my phone. It's called The Real Anthony Fauci that Robert Kennedy wrote. And he explains a lot of the stuff that's going on with health and wellness in the United States. And so here's the one. So what the question was, how did it get to Wuhan? And why did it get to Wuhan? And what I have put together is that it got to Wuhan because President Obama said, hey, stop all that stuff. He put a moratorium on gain of function research. They didn't want to stop their research, so they took it across to Wuhan because they were working with the Chinese in the United States in the first place. Now, it's not conspiracy, I don't think. I think that's valid, and that's exactly what Judy taught me back in 2020. And you say, who's this Judy lady that you're talking about? Right? It's like, okay, and this is Judy Mikovits. Let me find her. She earned a BA in chemistry from the University of Virginia in 1980 and a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology from George Washington University in 1992. In her 40-year quest to understand the causes, prevention, and treatment of chronic disease, she had co-authored seminal papers culminating at least a decade of research in each 4 fields: immunology, natural products, chemistry, epigenetics, and HIV/AIDS drug development. In 2009, Dr. Judy Mikovits led the team that first isolated and characterized a new family of human disease-associated retroviruses, XMRVs, and she's co-authored more than 50 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters and holds a patent for combination therapy for prostate cancer and botanical compositions and Casodex, whatever that means. Okay, but here's the thing. She started back in 1992, and she was working in a lab, and they were working on AIDS. And she personally has done gain of function research. And she talks about the time that she's done the gain of function research. And she's talked about that there is research, there is evidence, there is at least curious evidence. She's way more certain than that, but there is at least curious evidence that a mouse retrovirus might be causing prostate cancer. that a mice retrovirus might be related to chronic fatigue syndrome. And you say, okay, Jason, what does a mouse retrovirus mean? What does that mean? And it means when you pass something through a mouse, like a vaccine, that you're trying to attenuate, you're trying to make that vaccine weaker and weaker and weaker, because you can't inject it into a human being if it's so potent. Whatever the virus is, a flu virus or whatever. I don't know all the vaccines that have it, but if let's just say that let's use that as an example. Okay, I don't know if that's scientifically right, but let's use it as an example. If you take the flu virus and you just inject it into someone, it will make them have the flu. And so it's like, well, we don't want to do that. What we want to do is we want to attenuate that. We want to make that virus weaker. We want to make it weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. So how do we do that? Well, what Judy taught me is the way that you do that is you run that virus, you inject that virus into a mouse, and then you pull it back through, and it's recombinant, okay? And so in her book, Plague, there's in her book, Plague, she talks about this in depth. And she talks about, let me see. There we go. Okay, so this is in chapter 11, Science and Sensibility. She said, here we identify XMRV nucleic acids in the peripheral blood mononuclear cells of 68 of 101 people of chronic fatigue syndrome patients, whereas only 8 of 218 of regionally healthy controls contained XMRV DNA. Only 8 out of 218 had this XMRV. XMRV is this xenotrophic murine retrovirus. So now you take this virus, you run it through an animal, you pull it out of that animal, and what ends up happening is that in the process of all that, the animal's virus, a piece of the animal's virus attached itself to the virus that you were putting through the body. So now, when you pull it out of the body, you actually have a mouse virus in your flu shot. Now, I'm just using that as an example. I don't know if it's which one of those shots it is, but she has it all broken down. But that's what would happen. So now we're going to run it back through again, and we're going to run it back through again. And if we do it 100 times, we'll make that thing so weak that now it's weak enough to inject into a person. But now it's too weak to inject into a person, because if you inject it into a person, it's not going to make that person respond. So I have to put something with it in order to make it respond. So I got to put something like aluminum or mercury in the shot to make it respond. And I got to do that so that your body will respond to the virus. And aluminum is neurotoxic, and mercury is neurotoxic. And that's what Robert Kennedy Jr. is saying right now, is that in 1988, when President Reagan signed the law that said you couldn't sue vaccine manufacturers anymore, that instead of 9 doses of vaccines our kids get, now they get 72 doses, 16 vaccines and 72 doses. And that's what he's saying. It's like, look, and that's what she's saying. That's what Judy taught me. Because in this little sentence right here, in her control group, the people that didn't have chronic fatigue syndrome, 8 out of 218, 3.7% of healthy controls contained XMRV DNA. How in the heck did 8 or 3.4%? There's 320 something Americans. Do what 4% of 320 something million Americans. What is the math on that? 320 million Americans times 0.037 is 11 million Americans in the control group have a mouse retrovirus in their body. Yeah. How did they get that? And what she's saying is that 68% of the chronic fatigue syndrome patients got it. So there's a possibility that we all, at this point, there's a possibility that we all have retrovirus. We have retroviruses in our body anyway. There's no question about that. It's part of our DNA. It's part of the thousands of years we've been on the planet. And what she's trying to say is that we may be creating these new viruses in the way that we're running our health and wellness industry in the United States. And that's what I think. This is my show. This is Life with Jason Clemmons, DC. This is my personal belief. All of this stuff is what I'm sharing with you. This is what I think. What I think is, by the way that we do this, you got to get your shingles shot. You got to get your flu shot. You got to get your COVID shot. You got to get your next shot. You got to here you come. And then what is it when I know that there's not a single cell in any of the body, there's not a DNA in any cell in the body that it is your prostate cancer DNA. There's no evidence that we should be developing chronic disease. There's no genome, there's no scientific evidence that the human being should be having diabetes. There's no DNA that says that, because what we want to do is we want to say that it's genetic, that the reason I have it is because my daddy had it and my granddaddy had it, that it's genetic. And I'm saying that maybe it's not. Maybe we have ourselves in an environment that's incongruent with health. And I could read this. I was going to read some of this book and this whole thing, just in this original thing right here. Taken together, these data demonstrate the first direct isolation of infections of XMRV from humans and implicate a role of XMRV infection in the pathogenesis of chronic fatigue syndrome. And they tie it also to prostate cancer. And what is going on? So why do I care about Judy Mikovits? Because I think she's honest. Now, if you listen to her now, she's gotten off into all kinds of selling supplements and all this stuff, and she does all these because they ruined her whole career. She's trying to make a living, and so she's got to do it in a crazier way. If she could be in a lab, she'd rather be in a lab working on all this stuff, but they've ruined it for her because she spoke up against it. And she spoke up against it, and it ruined her whole career. I don't have any qualms with that. I don't even care who comes along. I've studied her enough to really believe that what she's saying is true. But it fits to me in the final report. Because it's like, okay, what are these guys saying? And these guys are saying what Judy told me 5 years ago, 2020. She's the one that taught me about mercury and the virus, and that the aluminum and the virus. She's the one that told me that the immunologist and the virologist don't like each other. They get in heated disagreements with each other. Because they're like, some of them, they're like, don't do that. Don't put, a virologist is like, don't do that. That's what Judy is. Don't put that toxin in the system, because what you're going to do is you're going to create an immune response. And Judy gets into serious, like in-depth stuff with the immune response. She talks about chronic fatigue syndrome is a multi-system disorder manifested by inflammatory sequelae. Here you go. Let me make sure I got it up there for you guys, because it is there. Chronic fatigue syndrome is a multi-system disorder manifested by inflammatory sequelae, including innate immune activation, antiviral enzyme, with this enzyme that's called RNase L, dysfunction, and low natural killer cell numbers and function. The recent discovery of the gamma retrovirus XMRV in men with familial prostate cancer harboring a reduced variant of this RNase L prompted us to test the hypothesis that XMRV might be associated with chronic fatigue syndrome. And the main thing that is important to me is manifested by inflammatory sequelae, including innate immune activation. Because we've said it on the show for a year now that inflammation is the initial stage of your immune response. So how do we keep our inflammation down? And why do we want to keep our inflammation down? And what difference does it make if that 3 technique steps with his right foot or his left foot? I'll tell you what difference it makes. I'll show you what difference it makes. Because this 3 technique playing right here, and this end playing right here, and here's this backer, okay? If this guy blocks out on him, and this guard comes up and blocks that linebacker, and that center, and this guard can hook my defensive tackle, that means there's nobody in the B gap. If the guard comes around and hooks my defensive tackle, the running back is going to run through the B gap and untouched. And if it's 4th and 2 from the goal line or 4th and 1 from the goal line and you get me hooked, I lose the game. If I stay in the gap and I stuff the gap, I win the game. That's how important, whether or not he steps with his right foot or his left foot, or whether or not he presses with his right hand or his left hand, matters to a 3 technique on the goal line in front of 100,000 people on national television. That's how important that is. And what I'm saying is that your inflammation level is just as important. Your inflammation level is one of the most important things in your body. And it has to do with Parkinson's, and it has to do with Alzheimer's, and it has to do with arthritis, and it has to do with chronic heart disease, and all the things. It has to do with all of them. And Judy talks about how every time we take another shot, we ramp up our immune system response, which means we ramp up our inflammation, we ramp up our interleukin-6 and our tumor necrosis factor, and all of those things inside of our body that's bringing our inflammation back up. And it's something that is vital for health. If you really want to know about health, it's vital for health. Drinking this crap right here that I have these little cans of is high fructose corn syrup. That's what I heard this week. Robert Kennedy wants to take high fructose corn syrup out of these drinks and put pure cane sugar in there, which 55% fructose versus 50% fructose. That's not the solution. That may be the solution to the Coke, but the solution to the Coke is leave it in the can. Because why? Because according to Dr. Lustig, high fructose corn syrup or fructose creates inflammation in the liver. It creates inflammation in the liver. And when you get inflammation in the liver, you increase the VLDL cholesterol and you increase your heart disease. If you have inflammation in your brain, like Dr. Bredesen talks about, and you have inflammation in your brain, you're going to increase your chances for Alzheimer's disease. If you have inflammation in your joints, which is such a pitiful little thing when you think about it as compared to your brain or your liver, if your knee has inflammation in it, your knee hurts, right? And how do you get inflammation in your knee? Create an imbalance of omega-6 and omega-3. Why do I talk about this crazy stuff all the time? Because of all this final report. Because they're not going to tell you. That's why I love Dan Murphy so much. In 2009, Dan Murphy showed me this stuff. He taught me this stuff. And that's what I'm teaching you. I'm sharing it with you. I'm doing the same exact thing. It's like, look, all this stuff stacks. It all stacks up. It's if I'm coaching defensive tackles at Texas A&M or Texas Tech or the Dallas Cowboys, I'm going to do it exactly the same way. I'm going to teach it the same way. If you're at 3 techniques, stay in that B gap. If I'm talking to people in the United States, if I'm talking to men or women, if I'm talking to infants, one of my ladies today went to Nature's Tonic and got some omega-3 fatty acids for an infant. Why? Because the infant is on formula. And what's the number one ingredients in formula? Corn syrup solids. What's the difference? We're feeding our children corn syrup solids. Why? Because we're subsidizing corn. Because we think we're supposed to eat corn. Because why? Because nobody knows. Nobody knows why we're supposed to eat corn. Because we're really not, it doesn't really do all that much for us, except make us sick. Man, we ran out of time, y'all. That's all I got for you tonight. I hope it was awesome. Thanks for listening to the show. If you got any questions, 806-794-0400, you can send me a text. Otherwise, I'm going to calm down and go eat some supper.